March 19, 1943, 15 miles northeast of the Palau Islands, Lieutenant Commander Mush Morton stood in the conning tower of USS Wahoo, his eyes locked on the periscope as a Japanese convoy materialized through the early morning haze. Around him, the fire control party worked with machine precision, calling out ranges, bearings, target speeds. But what the Japanese destroyer captains screening that convoy could not have imagined was that every number being shouted in Wahoo's cramped conning tower was feeding into a mechanical brain that could solve in seconds what would take a human calculator 15 minutes of frantic mathematics. The Torpedo Data Computer, an analog calculating machine weighing over 300 pounds and containing dozens of precision gears and cams, was silently computing firing solutions with an accuracy that defied human capability. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the months that followed, as Japanese naval officers compiled reports of impossible American torpedo accuracy, of submarines firing from absurd angles and still achieving hits, of attacks that violated every principle of geometric probability they understood, a disturbing pattern emerged. American submarines were no longer missing. They were hitting with mathematical precision that suggested either extraordinary luck sustained over hundreds of attacks, or access to some technological advantage that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to identify. The weapon that would revolutionize submarine warfare had been installed in American boats since 1938, tested and refined through years of peacetime exercises, integrated so thoroughly into American submarine doctrine that its operators barely thought about it anymore. Japanese submariners, relying on manual calculations and mechanical angle solvers that required perfect target data and ideal attack geometry, found themselves facing an enemy who could fire from any angle, compensate for target maneuvers instantaneously, and achieve hit rates that seemed to defy the laws of probability. The mathematics of submarine torpedo attacks are brutally unforgiving. A submarine firing a torpedo at a moving target must solve a problem that involves at least 7 variables, each of which can change during the minutes between detection and firing. The targets range from the submarine. The target's bearing relative to the submarine's heading. The target's course, the direction it is traveling. The target's speed through the water. The angle on the bow, the angle between the target's course and the line of sight from submarine to target. The submarine's own course and speed. The torpedo's running speed and the time it will take to reach the intercept point. These variables combine in a geometric problem that requires solving for the point in space where the torpedo and target will meet, accounting for the fact that both are moving and that the torpedo travels in a straight line while the target may maneuver. A human calculator working with slide rules, plotting boards, and mechanical calculators could solve this problem in approximately 10 to 15 minutes under ideal conditions, assuming the target maintained steady course and speed and the submarine remained at constant depth with a stable periscope observation platform. In combat, with the submarine rolling in heavy seas, the periscope making brief observations to avoid detection, the target zigzagging unpredictably, and enemy escorts searching for the submarine with active sonar, those ideal conditions never existed. Submarine commanders in the 1930s relied on what the U.S. Navy called the position method of fire control. The captain would observe the target through the periscope and estimate its range, bearing, course, and speed based on visual observation and experience. The fire control party would plot this information on a large sheet of paper marked with a polar coordinate grid, using parallel rulers and dividers to manually construct the geometric solution. They would calculate where the target would be at various times in the future, determine where the torpedo needed to be launched to intercept, calculate the required Euro angle for the torpedo to run on the correct course, and relay this information to the torpedo room. By the time this process was complete, the target had often changed course or speed, rendering the solution obsolete. The submarine would need to start over, recalculating everything while the target continued moving and the window for attack narrowed. Japanese submarines employed a similar manual fire control system throughout the war, using a device called the Type 92 mechanical angle solver that could help calculate some aspects of the firing solution but still required extensive manual plotting and calculation. The Type 92 was essentially an elaborate slide rule that could solve for target angle on the bow and required Euro angle, but it required the operator to input accurate target course, speed, and range, and it could not compensate for changes in these parameters during the attack. If the target zigged while the fire control party was calculating the solution, the entire process had to restart. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized patience and careful stalking, getting into ideal attack positions where the manual calculations were manageable, typically firing from positions directly ahead or astern of the target where the geometric problems simplified. The American Torpedo Data Computer represented a fundamentally different approach to the fire control problem. Developed by Arma Corporation and first installed aboard U.S. submarines starting in 1938, the TDC was an electromechanical analog computer that continuously solved the torpedo fire control problem in real time. Instead of requiring the fire control party to manually plot target information and calculate firing solutions, the TDC accepted inputs for target bearing, range, estimated course, and estimated speed, combined these with the submarine's own course and speed, and automatically calculated the required gyro angle for torpedo launch. More critically, it did this continuously, updating the solution dozens of times per minute as new periscope observations provided updated target bearings. The device itself was a marvel of mechanical engineering for its era. Inside the TDC's gray metal cabinet, dozens of precision gears, cams, and differentials performed mathematical operations mechanically. Rotation of one shaft represented target bearing. Rotation of another represented target range. The angle between shafts represented relative target motion. Differential gears combined these mechanical rotations to solve trigonometric equations. The output was a continuously updated gyro angle that represented where the torpedo needed to be aimed to hit the target. An operator could adjust target course and speed estimates using hand cranks, and the TDC would immediately recalculate the solution, showing whether the new estimates produced a consistent solution that matched observed target behavior. What made the TDC revolutionary was not just that it calculated faster than humans, though it did, solving in seconds what took humans minutes. What made it transformative was that it operated continuously and automatically. A submarine commander could keep his periscope up longer, taking multiple observations and feeding updated bearings into the TDC. The device would track target motion, automatically compensate for changes in the submarine's own course and speed as the captain maneuvered for attack position, and maintain a current firing solution at all times. When the captain decided to fire, the solution was already calculated and verified. The time between decision and torpedo launch compressed from minutes to seconds. The TDC also enabled an attack technique called the down-the-throat shot that was virtually impossible using manual fire control. When a submarine found itself detected and facing an oncoming enemy warship, whether a destroyer intent on ramming or a merchantman attempting to run down the submarine before it could dive, the traditional response was to dive deep and evade. The geometry of firing torpedoes at a target coming directly toward the submarine was extraordinarily difficult. The target angle on the bow was near 0 degrees, meaning the target's course and the line of sight from submarine to target were nearly identical. Any error in estimating target speed would result in the torpedo passing ahead of or behind the target. The target's range was changing rapidly as it closed. The time available to calculate and execute a firing solution was measured in seconds, not minutes. With manual fire control, a down-the-throat shot was effectively a desperation move with minimal probability of success. With the TDC, it became a viable tactical option. The device could track the rapidly changing geometry, compensate for the closing rate, and provide an accurate firing solution even as the target bore down on the submarine. American submarine commanders learned to trust the TDC in these desperate situations, firing spreads of torpedoes directly at oncoming destroyers and achieving hits that stopped the attack before the destroyer could drop depth charges. Japanese submariners facing similar situations had no choice but to dive and evade, surrendering the initiative and often taking severe depth charge damage in the process. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, demonstrated the capabilities of the TDC during Wahoo's third war patrol in January 1943. Operating in the confined waters near Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea, Morton detected a Japanese convoy and maneuvered Wahoo into attack position. The convoy consisted of 2 large transports escorted by a destroyer and several smaller patrol craft, zigzagging on a base course that would take them into WWII. Morton, aggressive to the point of recklessness, decided to attack on the surface in broad daylight, using Wahoo's superior speed to maneuver around the escorts. The attack that followed would have been impossible without the TDC. Morton ordered Wahoo to flank speed on the surface, racing ahead of the convoy to gain position. The submarine's motion was violent as she pounded through moderate seas at 17 knots, far faster than the stable platform needed for manual fire control calculations. Executive Officer Dick O'Kane stood at the periscope, calling out bearings to the targets as they changed rapidly due to Wahoo's high-speed maneuvers. The TDC absorbed each bearing, combined it with Wahoo's course and speed from the ship's gyrocompass and pit log, and continuously updated the firing solution. Morton fired 6 torpedoes in a carefully timed spread at the leading transport from a range of 3,000 yards. All 6 torpedoes were fired while Wahoo was traveling at high speed on an angled course relative to the target. With manual fire control, achieving any hits under these conditions would have required extraordinary luck. The TDC calculated the complex geometry flawlessly. 3 torpedoes struck the transport along its length. The ship, a former passenger liner converted to military transport and carrying reinforcements for Japanese garrisons in New Guinea, took the hits below the waterline and began settling immediately. Troops crowded the decks as the transport listed heavily to port. Morton swung Wahoo toward the second transport, which had turned away and was fleeing toward WWII at maximum speed. The destroyer escort, having finally recognized the threat, was charging toward Wahoo's position with the clear intention of ramming. Morton made a decision that would have been suicidal with manual fire control. He fired 4 torpedoes down the throat at the oncoming destroyer from a range of 1,200 yards, then immediately swung Wahoo back toward the fleeing transport. The destroyer, traveling at 30 knots and closing rapidly, presented an almost impossible target for a down-the-throat shot. The range was changing at over 50 yards per second. Any miscalculation of the destroyer's speed would result in the torpedoes passing harmlessly ahead or astern. The TDC tracked the geometry, calculated the intercept point, and provided a firing solution. 2 torpedoes struck the destroyer forward, the explosions tearing away the bow and bringing the ship to a sudden halt. The destroyer settled by the bow and capsized within 5 minutes. Wahoo turned her attention to the second transport, now racing for the harbor entrance with patrol craft converging to screen it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morton drove Wahoo directly into the harbor mouth, violating every tenet of cautious submarine warfare, and fired 3 torpedoes at the transport from a range of 800 yards. All 3 hit. The transport exploded spectacularly, apparently carrying munitions in addition to troops. The ship broke apart and sank in less than a minute. Morton then spent the next several hours conducting what he would later describe as a shooting gallery, systematically attacking and sinking Japanese patrol craft, auxiliary vessels, and a stranded destroyer that had run aground during evasive maneuvers. Wahoo fired 20 torpedoes during the engagement and claimed 9 ships sunk. Post-war analysis would revise the total to 4 confirmed sinkings, but the engagement demonstrated capabilities that Japanese observers found difficult to comprehend. A submarine operating on the surface in broad daylight in confined waters had engaged multiple targets simultaneously, firing accurately while conducting high-speed maneuvers, achieving hit rates that suggested either remarkable luck or some technological advantage. Japanese naval intelligence officers reviewing reports from survivors of the WWII engagement noted the unusual accuracy of American torpedo fire but attributed it primarily to aggressive American submarine commanders willing to take extraordinary risks to close to point-blank range. The possibility that American submarines possessed some computational advantage that enabled accurate fire control under conditions where manual calculations would be impossible was not seriously considered. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized stealth and caution, attacking from carefully established positions after patient stalking. The idea that submarines could attack effectively while maneuvering at high speed seemed to contradict fundamental principles of submarine warfare. This intelligence failure reflected broader Japanese assumptions about American technical capabilities. Japanese naval officers, educated in a system that emphasized spiritual will and warrior ethos over technological solutions, often viewed American reliance on mechanical calculating devices as evidence of weakness rather than strength. The ideal Japanese submarine commander was supposed to develop an intuitive feel for torpedo attacks, estimating target course and speed through experience and firing based on practiced judgment rather than calculated solutions. Mechanical devices were aids to this intuitive process, not replacements for it. American submarine doctrine took the opposite approach. Submarine commanders were trained to trust the TDC completely, to feed it accurate observational data and accept its calculated solutions. The emphasis was on getting good target data into the computer and executing the solution it provided rather than relying on intuitive judgment. This philosophical difference reflected broader cultural attitudes toward technology and human capability. Americans trusted machines to perform calculations better than humans. Japanese trusted human judgment refined through training and experience. The consequences of this difference became apparent as the war progressed and American submarine commanders learned to exploit the TDC's capabilities fully. Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, would achieve some of the most spectacular results of the submarine war by using the TDC to enable attacks that Japanese submariners would have considered impossible. On June 23, 1944, Fluckey took Barb into Nanquan Harbor on the China coast, a shallow anchorage protected by minefields and shore batteries where a Japanese convoy had taken refuge. Japanese doctrine held that submarines could not operate effectively in such confined waters where there was no room for evasive maneuvers and where shore batteries and patrol craft could trap and destroy an attacking submarine. Fluckey disagreed. He took Barb into the harbor on the surface at night, navigating by radar through the minefield approaches. Once inside the harbor, he found himself surrounded by targets, more than 30 ships anchored in the protected waters. The geometric problem was extraordinarily complex. Multiple targets at different ranges and bearings. The submarine moving through the anchorage at varying speeds and courses. Shore batteries beginning to illuminate the area with searchlights as the alarm spread. Patrol craft getting underway to intercept. With manual fire control, attacking even one target under these conditions would have been nearly impossible. Attacking multiple targets would have been unthinkable. Fluckey had the TDC. He designated 4 targets, large cargo ships anchored in positions that offered the best angles. His fire control party fed continuous updates into the TDC as Barb maneuvered through the anchorage. Fluckey fired 10 torpedoes in a carefully calculated sequence, each aimed at a different target, with the TDC providing a new solution for each shot as Barb's position and heading changed. The attack lasted 5 minutes. When it ended, 4 ships were sinking or burning. Barb raced out of the harbor at full speed on the surface, dodging patrol craft and outrunning the pursuing Japanese vessels. The Japanese Naval Command, reviewing reports from the Nanquan Harbor attack, concluded that multiple American submarines must have penetrated the anchorage simultaneously to achieve the number of torpedo hits reported. The alternative explanation, that a single submarine had successfully engaged 4 separate targets while maneuvering at high speed through confined waters, seemed to violate the physical limitations of submarine warfare as Japanese doctrine understood them. What Japanese intelligence failed to recognize was that the TDC had fundamentally changed those physical limitations. American submarines were no longer constrained by the time required for manual fire control calculations. They could attack from positions and under conditions that would have made manual solutions impossible. They could engage multiple targets in rapid succession. They could fire accurately while maneuvering violently. They could execute down-the-throat shots against attacking escorts. The computational advantage translated directly into tactical flexibility that Japanese submariners simply did not possess. The pattern of unexplainable American submarine accuracy continued throughout 1943 and into 1944, accumulating in Japanese naval intelligence files as a troubling anomaly that defied conventional explanation. Captain Takeshi Nakazawa, serving as a submarine warfare analyst at Imperial Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo, spent months reviewing action reports from merchant captains, destroyer commanders, and surviving crew members of sunken vessels. The accounts shared disturbing commonalities. American submarines were firing from angles that should have produced misses. They were achieving hits while conducting evasive maneuvers. They were engaging targets in rapid succession with accuracy that suggested either impossibly skilled fire control parties or access to some advantage Japanese analysts had failed to identify. Nakazawa compiled a statistical analysis that should have alarmed senior commanders. American submarine hit rates had improved from approximately 18% in early 1942 to over 40% by late 1943. This improvement could not be explained by experience alone. Japanese submarine commanders, many with years more combat experience than their American counterparts, were achieving hit rates in the 20 to 25% range. The mathematical probability of the American improvement curve suggested systematic advantages rather than random variation or individual commander skill. More troubling were reports of American submarines firing accurate spreads while traveling at high speed on the surface. Japanese submarine doctrine held that accurate torpedo fire required a stable firing platform, ideally a submerged submarine maintaining steady depth and course. Surface attacks were considered desperation measures undertaken only when surprise and speed could substitute for accuracy. Yet American submarines routinely conducted surface attacks in daylight, maneuvering aggressively, and still achieving hit rates comparable to or better than carefully calculated submerged attacks. Nakazawa's report reached senior naval staff officers in early 1944 and received a response that reflected institutional biases deeply embedded in Japanese naval culture. The improvement in American submarine performance, the assessment concluded, resulted from growing American commander experience combined with the sheer number of American submarines now operating in the Pacific. With over 100 American boats conducting war patrols by 1944, even mediocre hit rates would produce substantial sinkings. The possibility that American submarines possessed some technological advantage in fire control was mentioned but dismissed as unlikely. If such an advantage existed, Japanese technical intelligence would have identified it through examination of captured equipment or interrogation of prisoners. This confidence in Japanese technical intelligence capabilities was misplaced. The Torpedo Data Computer, while not classified at the highest secret level, was not a device that Japanese forces had captured intact and functional. Several American submarines had been lost by 1944, but most had been sunk by depth charges in deep water where recovery of equipment was impossible. The submarine Sculpin, sunk in November 1943 after a devastating depth charge attack, had gone down in water over 2,000 feet deep, taking her TDC with her. Some crew members survived and were captured, but Japanese interrogators, not understanding what questions to ask, never learned details about the fire control computer. The few prisoners who mentioned the device in interrogation described it in terms that Japanese interpreters found confusing. One survivor, attempting to explain the TDC's function, described it as a machine that automatically calculated torpedo firing angles. The interrogator, assuming this referred to some type of mechanical angle solver similar to Japanese equipment, noted the information but assigned it no particular significance. Another prisoner mentioned that American submarines could fire accurately while maneuvering because the computer compensated for the submarine's motion. This detail, potentially revelatory, was recorded but not forwarded to technical intelligence because the interrogator assumed it described a gyroscope stabilization system rather than a computational device. Japanese submarine officers who encountered American boats in combat and survived to report their observations provided additional clues that intelligence analysts failed to interpret correctly. Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, who would later command the submarine that sank the cruiser Indianapolis, engaged an American submarine in a brief surface gun duel in early 1944 before both vessels dove to avoid approaching aircraft. Hashimoto reported that the American boat had maneuvered aggressively during the brief engagement, changing course and speed repeatedly, yet had still managed to fire torpedoes that passed uncomfortably close to his vessel. Hashimoto noted in his action report that the American captain appeared to be employing some method of fire control that allowed accurate shooting despite violent maneuvers. The report was filed and forgotten. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized the impossibility of accurate fire control during high-speed maneuvering. If an American submarine commander had achieved near misses under those conditions, Japanese analysts concluded, he must have been extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily skilled, not that he possessed superior equipment. The cultural bias toward attributing success to individual warrior spirit rather than technological advantage prevented Japanese intelligence from recognizing a pattern that should have been obvious. By mid-1944, the cumulative weight of evidence should have forced a reassessment. American submarines were operating with increasing boldness, penetrating harbors and anchorages that Japanese doctrine considered too dangerous for submarine operations. They were engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. They were achieving hit rates that exceeded Japanese submarine performance by significant margins. Yet Japanese naval intelligence continued to attribute American success primarily to numerical superiority and commander aggressiveness rather than systematic technological advantages. The institutional resistance to acknowledging American technical superiority reflected deeper problems in Japanese military culture. The Japanese naval establishment had invested enormous intellectual and financial capital in developing what it considered the world's most advanced torpedoes, the oxygen-fueled Type 93 that outranged any comparable weapon. Japanese surface ships carried these weapons and achieved spectacular successes in night surface actions early in the war. The idea that Americans might have developed superior fire control systems for submarine warfare challenged assumptions about Japanese technical leadership that senior officers were unwilling to question. Furthermore, acknowledging that American submarines possessed significant technical advantages would have required explaining why Japanese submarines, operating with manual fire control systems, could not achieve comparable results. Such an admission would have reflected poorly on Japanese submarine commanders and Japanese naval engineering. It was psychologically easier to attribute American success to factors like numerical superiority, captured Japanese charts showing safe navigation routes, or intelligence advantages from code breaking than to acknowledge that American engineers had developed a fire control computer superior to anything in Japanese service. The consequences of this intelligence failure became increasingly severe as American submarines exploited their computational advantage to conduct operations that Japanese planners considered impossible. Commander Samuel Dealey, commanding USS Harder, demonstrated the tactical flexibility the TDC enabled during a series of engagements in June 1944 that would earn him a posthumous Medal of Honor and establish him as one of the most aggressive submarine commanders of the war. Operating off the coast of Borneo, Dealey detected a Japanese destroyer conducting anti-submarine patrol and made a decision that conventional submarine doctrine would have condemned as reckless bordering on suicidal. Instead of evading the destroyer, Dealey maneuvered Harder directly toward the enemy warship and prepared to fire a down-the-throat shot. The destroyer, detecting Harder's presence through sonar, turned to ram, accelerating to flank speed and charging directly at the submerged submarine. The geometry was brutally unforgiving. The destroyer was traveling at over 30 knots. Range was closing at nearly 1,000 yards per minute. Any error in estimating target speed or any delay in firing would result in either torpedoes passing ahead of the target or the destroyer ramming Harder before the torpedoes could reach it. Dealey's fire control party fed continuous bearing updates into the TDC as the destroyer closed. The device tracked the rapidly changing geometry and calculated the precise moment to fire. Dealey waited until the range closed to less than 900 yards, close enough that lookouts on the destroyer could see Harder's periscope if they looked carefully, then fired 3 torpedoes in a tight spread. The torpedoes ran straight and true. 2 struck the destroyer just below the waterline forward. The explosions tore the bow completely off the ship. The destroyer, traveling at high speed when the torpedoes hit, drove its torn bow under and plunged forward, breaking apart and sinking in less than 3 minutes. Dealey had just eliminated a destroyer escort using a tactic that Japanese submarine commanders, lacking comparable fire control capabilities, would not have attempted. Over the following 5 days, Harder would sink 4 more destroyers using similar down-the-throat attacks, systematically destroying the escort screen protecting a Japanese convoy with aggressiveness that reflected absolute confidence in the TDC's computational accuracy. The 5 destroyer sinkings in 6 days earned Harder legendary status in the American submarine force and caused significant disruption to Japanese convoy operations in the area. Japanese naval commanders, analyzing reports from the few survivors of Harder's attacks, could not comprehend how an American submarine had successfully engaged and destroyed 5 destroyers in rapid succession. Destroyers were supposed to be submarine hunters, not submarine prey. The idea that a submarine could deliberately attack destroyers, particularly using head-on shots against charging enemy warships, contradicted fundamental assumptions about submarine warfare. The assessment concluded that Harder's captain must have been either insane or possessed of extraordinary courage, achieving success through sheer audacity that overcame the technical disadvantages of submarine versus destroyer engagements. What the assessment missed was that Dealey's attacks were not desperate gambles but calculated tactical maneuvers enabled by technology that eliminated much of the risk. With the TDC providing accurate firing solutions for down-the-throat shots, engaging destroyers became a viable tactic rather than a suicide mission. American submarine commanders learned to trust the computer's calculations and execute attacks that would have been impossible with manual fire control. The tactical implications extended beyond individual engagements to fundamentally alter the balance of power between submarines and surface escorts. The strategic consequences of this technological advantage manifested most clearly in the systematic destruction of Japanese merchant shipping that accelerated through 1944 and into 1945. American submarines, freed from the constraints of manual fire control calculations, could engage targets under conditions that Japanese submarines would have avoided. They could attack in rough weather when manual plotting was nearly impossible. They could fire while conducting evasive maneuvers to avoid escorts. They could engage multiple targets in rapid succession without the delays inherent in manual calculations. The cumulative effect was to make American submarines dramatically more efficient hunters than Japanese boats despite operating in the same waters against similar targets. Commander Richard O'Kane, who had served as executive officer on Wahoo under Morton before receiving his own command, took USS Tang on 5 war patrols that would establish records for tonnage sunk that would stand for the remainder of the war. O'Kane's success reflected both personal skill and ruthless exploitation of the TDC's capabilities. On Tang's 3rd patrol in the Formosa Strait in June 1944, O'Kane encountered a Japanese convoy of 6 cargo ships escorted by 2 destroyers. Conventional tactics would have called for a submerged approach, careful stalking to achieve ideal position, and an attack on the largest target before evading at depth. O'Kane attacked on the surface at night, using radar to track targets and maneuvering Tang at high speed between escorts to fire at multiple ships. The TDC allowed him to maintain accurate firing solutions despite Tang's violent maneuvering as she dodged between enemy vessels. In a 40-minute engagement that resembled surface warfare more than traditional submarine tactics, O'Kane fired 16 torpedoes and sank 5 cargo ships totaling over 20,000 tons. The convoy scattered in confusion as ships exploded and burned around them. The destroyer escorts, unable to locate Tang in the darkness and unable to protect all the merchantmen simultaneously, could only watch as their charges went to the bottom. Japanese merchant captains who survived attacks by Tang and other American submarines filed reports that described attack patterns that made no tactical sense according to Japanese submarine doctrine. American submarines were firing from multiple angles during single engagements, suggesting either multiple submarines operating in coordination or individual boats changing position rapidly between shots. They were achieving hits on targets that were zigzagging violently through emergency maneuvers. They were firing accurate spreads while escorts were actively hunting them with depth charges. The accumulation of these reports should have prompted serious investigation into what American submarines were doing differently. Instead, Japanese naval intelligence attributed the pattern to the large number of American submarines now operating in Japanese-controlled waters. With over 100 American boats conducting war patrols by late 1944, it was statistically probable that some would achieve extraordinary results through luck or commander skill. The possibility that every American submarine possessed a technological advantage that fundamentally altered submarine warfare capabilities was not seriously considered until it was far too late to matter. The breaking point came in October 1944 when Japanese technical intelligence finally obtained a partially functional TDC from a submarine that ran aground in shallow water. The submarine Darter, operating in Palawan Passage during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, struck an uncharted reef while pursuing damaged Japanese cruisers and became stuck fast. The crew abandoned ship after demolition charges failed to sink the vessel in the shallow water. Japanese forces reached the wreck within hours and began salvaging equipment before American forces could return to destroy it completely. Among the equipment recovered was Tang's Torpedo Data Computer, damaged but sufficiently intact that Japanese engineers could determine its function through examination. The device was transported to Tokyo for analysis by naval technical experts who had been skeptical of reports suggesting American submarines possessed some computational advantage. What they discovered shocked them. The TDC was not simply a mechanical angle solver like Japanese equipment. It was a complete analog computer that continuously solved the entire fire control problem in real time, compensating automatically for submarine maneuvers and providing updated solutions dozens of times per minute. Japanese engineers, examining the intricate mechanism of gears and differentials that performed mathematical operations mechanically, recognized immediately that American submarines had been operating with an enormous advantage throughout the war. The device explained the accuracy of American torpedo fire under conditions where manual calculations would have been impossible. It explained the ability of American submarines to engage multiple targets rapidly. It explained the tactical flexibility that had allowed American commanders to conduct attacks that Japanese doctrine considered too risky or too complex. The report detailing the TDC's capabilities reached Naval Staff Headquarters in November 1944 and prompted an urgent investigation into why this critical intelligence had not been identified earlier. The investigation revealed a catalog of failures. Interrogators who had questioned American prisoners had not asked the right questions and had not recognized the significance of answers they received. Technical intelligence officers had assumed that American submarine fire control systems were comparable to Japanese equipment and had not pursued evidence suggesting otherwise. Combat reports from Japanese commanders had been interpreted through the lens of existing doctrine rather than used to question doctrinal assumptions. Most damaging was the discovery that pre-war Japanese naval attachés in the United States had actually observed American submarines conducting exercises and had filed reports mentioning elaborate fire control equipment installed in American boats. These reports, filed in 1939 and 1940, had been reviewed by technical intelligence and dismissed as describing standard fire control apparatus comparable to Japanese equipment. Nobody had investigated further to determine exactly what the equipment did or how it functioned. The intelligence failure had been complete and had persisted for the entire war. By November 1944, when Japanese naval intelligence finally understood the nature of the American advantage, correcting it was impossible. Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the engineering expertise, and the time to design, test, and produce comparable fire control computers for its submarines. Even if such computers could be designed, manufacturing them would require machine tools and precision manufacturing capabilities that Japanese industry could no longer deliver. American strategic bombing had destroyed much of Japan's precision manufacturing capacity. Raw material shortages made producing complex equipment increasingly difficult. The window for addressing the technological gap had closed years earlier. Japanese submarine operations for the remainder of the war continued using manual fire control methods while American submarines operated with computational advantages that Japanese commanders could finally understand but could not counter. The asymmetry in capability translated directly into wildly different effectiveness rates. American submarines continued sinking Japanese merchant shipping at rates approaching 200,000 tons per month through the first half of 1945. Japanese submarines, conducting increasingly desperate missions as their bases were overrun and their logistics collapsed, achieved minimal results using tactics and equipment that were obsolete by comparison. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.